Hey, I'm Pastor Josiah Black from Peru First Baptist Church, and this is our weekly ongoing video Bible study, and we are still in the book of Colossians on chapter 3. Actually, today we will be wrapping that up. So we're going to be looking at a bigger chunk today, but I think it should still take about the same amount of time because some of this is fairly straightforward and doesn't require much explanation, okay? So we're going to be looking at verses 18 all the way to the end at verse 25. So let me go ahead and get us started by reading this whole section. Wives, submit to your husbands as is fitting for those who belong to the Lord. Husbands, love your wives and never treat them harshly. Children, always obey your parents, for this pleases the Lord. Fathers, do not aggravate your children, or they will become discouraged. Slaves, obey your earthly masters in everything you do. Try to please them all the time, not just when they are watching you. Serve them sincerely because of your reverent fear of the Lord. Work willingly at whatever you do, as though you are working for the Lord rather than for people. Remember that the Lord will give you an inheritance as your reward, and the master you are serving is Christ. But if you do what is wrong, you will be paid back for the wrong you have done, for God has no favorites. So that's actually all the way to the end of chapter 3. And let's go ahead and start diving into that a little bit. I think it's important here that there are a couple places in this selection of scripture, a couple of these verses have been used over the years in ways that I certainly don't think Paul would have ever intended them to be used. Okay. So first of all, let's go ahead and start with wives, submit to your husbands as is fitting for those who belong to the Lord. Husbands, love your wives and never treat them harshly. Yeah, I think we have to take those two together. All right. Now look, what I'm not going to get into today are issues of male headship, whether you feel like the man is the sole head of the household, or whether you feel like it's more appropriate for both parties to have sort of an equality in that. We're not going to dive deep and go down that particular rabbit hole. There are ways that both of those perspectives can be argued and talked about that involve both this passage and other passages in Scripture. Okay, but we're not gonna pick that particular fight today, because I think Paul's point here was twofold. First of all, Paul from these Christians wanted to see an orderly, healthy family relationship. He wanted them to be stable in the relationship that they had. And the best model that they had for that was this notion of wives, submit to your husbands, husbands, love your wives and don't treat them harshly. There's an implication there of thing number two is that he wanted to see mutual love and respect between these two parties. Okay. Those were the things that would mark the Christian household as different from other households: mutual love and respect, and a sense that, okay, this place is together, it's safe, it's orderly, not orderly in the sense of, everybody does exactly what they're supposed to do all the time, but orderly in the sense of that this was not a place of chaos. There was not constantly infighting within a given household. These people lived peacefully with one another in ways that showed the world Jesus. Okay, that's what Paul's looking for from these two verses, and we can look deeper. And again, to address the argument of who's in charge, we can look at this place, we can look at other scriptures, and I genuinely think you can argue either way as far as what Paul's saying. It comes down to certain interpretive choices. But I think what we can pull out of this both times is the idea that there should be mutual love, there should be mutual respect. This should be something that both members of the couple are continuing to choose to prioritize their relationship with one another, to prioritize good relationship with their family, and to see those things through. And there were a lot of things going on in the culture around Paul at this time. And so this is also an address of those things. There were, at the time, quite probably, a class of women coming up out of Roman society who were very much, I'm going to do what I want. I'm not accountable to anyone or anything. And I'm going to continue to live exactly how I want to live. And in some ways, it was an overcorrection from years of women in Rome being subjugated and not being treated with love, respect, and kindness, essentially being treated harshly. So Paul is both addressing that overcorrection and also addressing forces in the culture and husbands who would treat their wives harshly, whether that's physically, verbally, whatever we want to get to. But the idea here is that Paul's trying to say, okay, both of these things need to be brought. Doesn't mean they're the same, right? But both of these things need to be in balance. And this is what I want it to look like. Children, always obey your parents, for this pleases the Lord. Fathers, do not aggravate your children, or they would become discouraged. I'm sure all the parents appreciate that Paul included this one in the Bible. And I think it is right and good that children be obedient to their parents. It's actually noteworthy that Paul included direction for children, because remember, in this day and age, depending on your culture, the reverence that were held for children, they weren't a protected class in some ways like they are now. A lot of children might have been sent out to work. They might have been doing other things. They might have been in the streets. There are a lot of different places children could be. And so for Paul to include them as a recognition and an acknowledgement that they are people and that they matter and that they have a role and a part to play in the family too. So it's actually pretty cool to see that. And again, it would be painting with too broad a brush to say all the children of Rome were not treated well. That's not accurate at all. But the point is that there were a lot of different experiences that children had, and they were, generally speaking, not as protected and fawned over as they are now. And you might be inclined to say that children now are perhaps too protected and fawned over. Sure, have your opinion. That's okay. We're not going to get into that. But the children who had bad experiences in this, it would have been pretty bad. All kinds of things happening to them. Them barely being seen as human until they're adults. The low end was lower than much of what we see in childhood experiences today. Not all of, unfortunately, there are still places where kids are not treated well at all, but for much of. Fathers, do not aggravate your children, or they would become discouraged. Again, this is also a really important thing here that Paul expects fathers, he names specifically. I think we often expand that to include fathers and mothers, but I think perhaps fathers were the people most inclined to aggravating their children, if you will. Or fathers, do not aggravate your children, or they will become discouraged. Genuinely, this is interpreted as don't harp on them, don't be so harsh on them that they don't have any sense of your love or your care for them. Don't make their lives hard just for the sake of making them hard. There are a lot of different things kind of wrapped and rolled into this. It's not like fathers don't tease your children, fathers don't give your children. It's like fathers don't be so bad to them that they stumble, they become discouraged, that they don't want to be a part of your family, or that they rebel. Don't push them out. Clearly something Paul was seeing or witnessing in family dynamics that he wanted to make sure was corrected. Hey, in our context, in my Jewish culture and in our now shared Christian culture, we love children. We treat them with respect. We treat them with care. We give them the time they need, just like Jesus did. And so that's what Paul's trying to come back around to and reinforce here. So important stuff. These are kind of foundational. This is a primer for what the household should have looked like or how it should have operated. And I think it's important to note that this is very Jewish. This is comes from Paul's experience as part of that culture, and how God in the Old Testament sort of spoke into and helped them figure out how families are supposed to work and what's healthy. And this is Paul trying to carry that forward. So this probably would have been especially directed towards Gentile folks coming in who maybe didn't share these values, or it would have been directed towards the Jewish folks in the church who weren't doing a particularly good job of embodying these things. Okay, so that's your target audience here. And also just as a general reminder to everybody that, hey, this is what we want our Christian households to look like. So just like, unfortunately, verse 18 in the past has been used to unfairly burden or to try to control wives and women, which again is not good and wouldn't be healthy male headship, even if that's the direction you want to come at it from. So unfortunately, verse 18 has been used like that. In the same way, verse 22, which I'm about to read, has been used in in some negative ways too. So we're going to try to untangle that a little bit, but let's go ahead and hear it out. Slaves, obey your earthly masters in everything you do. Try to please them all the time, not just when they are watching you. Serve them sincerely because of your reverent fear of the Lord. Work willingly at whatever you do, as though you were working for the Lord rather than for people. Remember that the Lord will give you an inheritance as your reward, and the master you are serving is Christ. But if you do what is wrong, you'll be paid back for the wrong you have done, for God has no favorites. So I think you can probably guess where this has been problematic, but we need to address it. So let's get into it. Obviously, in most parts of our world today, slavery is not a thing anymore. Certainly we wish we could say all parts, but that simply isn't true. However, we have to understand that slaves in the time of Rome, and I hope you've heard this before, had a very different experience than North American slaves, folks who were brought here from the Caribbean or from Africa. It was a very different experience between those two types of slavery. Might sound strange to talk about types of slavery, but in Rome, there was a very complex legal code around the treatment of slaves. They had certain rights and protections. Some people would even willingly go into slavery because it was a more stable economic position for them. While the idea of being owned certainly would be a turnoff for most of us, for some of these folks, it provided a way out of worse situations because your slave master, again, in the Roman context, was expected to treat you certain ways, and those things were watched over and enforced by law. Now, of course, we don't know, because we're years removed, we don't know what the actual experience was. There could have been some pretty bad experiences, and I'm sure there were, bad slave owners and good slave owners, et cetera, in that context, okay? But that's the important thing to understand, is that slaves essentially in Rome were a protected legal class. There were certain rights they were entitled to, and in general, Rome at least made efforts to enforce those things. And if you treated your slaves badly, there were consequences for you that were beyond just moral and spiritual consequences of owning another person, okay? However, this verse was used very abusively in the North American slave system to essentially try to keep and enforce and suggest that there was something morally right about what they were doing in terms of slavery. But keep in mind that by and large, for African slaves and for slaves brought from the Caribbean and for the Native Americans here that were enslaved, there were no rights or legal protections. They were truly treated like property, which means that the slave owner was the sole authority in terms of how those people could and would be treated, which means that the awful things that we hear that went on in North American slavery and the way those folks were treated is very, very different than what people in Rome at the time that this was written would have experienced. Unfortunately, Christians at the time and other folks who pretended to be Christian, that sort of thing, use this verse to say, no, look, right here in the Bible, slavery is a-okay, and it says here that these slaves need to obey us, and it doesn't say anything about how we're supposed to treat them, because they're things. So slaves are just supposed to do this. And okay, so, and also, by the way, I'm Christ to them, because that's what verse 24 says. Remember that the Lord will give you an inheritance as your reward, and the master that you are serving is Christ. Now, obviously, Paul is talking metaphorically here, and he kind of shifts gears from this slave thing to talking about our relationship with Christ. Paul would say we're all slaves to Christ, because he was trying to, using this thing that he understood at his time, talk about that relationship between Christ and the individual. Unfortunately, again, at other points in history, this was used as a way of saying, no, it's right for me to own you. And I cannot stress enough how terrible and abusive of the use of scripture that is, okay? I don't want to belabor the point. We obviously know, hopefully we know that slavery is wrong, right? That to own another person is a terrible thing. And certainly to own another person under the conditions that were often true for slaves in North America is egregious, terrible sin, a terrible way to treat another human being. And so any effort to use these verses to justify that ignores entirely the context Paul was speaking to. So I want to be clear here. And the reason I'm even going into this is because of how these arguments and these verses have been used before. And it's a great example, unfortunately, of how not understanding the context scripture was written in can lead us to places we don't want to go and can allow scripture to be used abusively. So one of the reasons we have to study this and we have to understand it is we have to really take the time to get it. Otherwise, if we're just doing these off the cuff things, or if we're using it in ways that's just to benefit us, that in my mind is an abuse of scripture. So we've got to be careful with that. But I do think for Paul, this is a handy little metaphor here in the end, 24 and 25. This notice that, remember, the Lord will give you inheritance as your reward, and the master you are serving is Christ. Again, in Paul's context, where the slavery piece wasn't quite the same, and where we can see slavery as more of certainly a lower social power, but not necessarily an abused class of people, we can understand then this metaphor that he's using between Christ and the master, so to speak. This idea that I am lesser than Christ, I'm lesser than God, and I am to serve him wholeheartedly, to work diligently for him, to give him my best. And that's what I've been called into as a Christian. Of course, it says, but if you do what is wrong, you will be paid back for wrong you have done, for God has no favorites. Paul's talking in terms of ultimate consequences here. He's not talking about some notion of karma, where like if you do the bad thing's going to come back around and get you, like in this life. Paul's talking again about to live in sin and brokenness and separation from God is going to lead to a negative outcome. So that's where we're going here in these particular verses. So yeah, that's the wrap on Colossians chapter 3. We've got one more chapter in Colossians below. I'm going to throw up as a discussion question this time. I'm going to ask again what you'd like to see next, because I do want to continue to do this series. There are really only a few of us right now who participate in it, and that's okay. It doesn't bother me to continue to do it. But I've enjoyed that it keeps me in scripture, and it keeps me being able to study and dive into these topics. And I hope you've enjoyed doing that too. So again, I'll post it again in the text chat portion of the Facebook post, but be thinking about what book you'd like to dive into next, and what we can cover there. I may be more inclined to do another Old Testament book after this, but if you've got New Testament things you want to see, throw them out there and we'll take a look. Okay. So thanks as always for joining. I hope this was useful. I hope it was edifying, and I will see you next week as we dive into chapter 4. I'm guessing we'll have 2 to 3 weeks left on Colossians. So see you then. Bye.